Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about what is an RPG. Yes, I'm going to wade into this minefield of trying to define what a role-playing game is, at least on a computer. I see people talk about this all the time. People look at some games and go, that's not an RPG. And look at other games and go, that's the quintessential RPG. And my whole career, and even before my career, I always viewed RPGs as a continuum. That there are some games that are more RPG like and others that are less. Especially lately when games are coming out that people say have RPG elements. I'm like, okay. And they never really define RPG elements, but they talk about it. So what I want to do is, now that I've said, okay, I think RPG is a term that defines a continuum of games, I want to talk about what that continuum is. And you can think of this as a checklist of game features. And the more of these features you have, the more I would consider you an RPG. And then I'll talk about how other people view this when I'm done. So I'm going to start my checklist off. These are in a particular order, but I'm not going to tell you what the order is until I'm done, because I want you to just to listen to the checklist. So these are game features that I think make a game an RPG. The first one is that I can make my own character, including naming my character. Now, I think this is pretty important, because I think character creation choices should matter. I'm not saying that they should be incredibly limiting, but they should be reflected somewhere in the game as this decision you made is what is causing this. Now, this can be everything from the class you chose, to the race, to the gender, to your attributes, to your background, to your skills. Something in the game should be checking that choice you made and changing. Now, for gender, it could be as simple as how people refer to you, as whether they say he or him or her or now they. It's not a big deal. It's just that's a small thing. In some of my games, I made it a bigger deal, where your gender controlled what attribute bonuses you started with. And I felt like as long as that was balanced, that was fine. Some people didn't like that. That's okay. I find, though, that if a character creation has too few of these, and notice I didn't even mention appearance. A lot of games just spend so much time on appearance, especially games where I'm never going to see my face, but I spend an hour making my face. If those things don't really matter to me, like if what the choices I make on my appearance aren't going to matter, I'm far less interested in them. So games of mine that did have those appearance changing things, somebody else wanted it, and I'm like, okay, I don't want to spend too much resources on this, but okay. I want those character creation choices to matter. Similarly, once you're playing the character, I want the player character to have a lot of choices on how to act. So this is once you're created, the choices how you act in the game should matter. This can be high level, like whether you decide to do combat or stealth or dialogue or have companions versus playing solo, to basically what your character does moment to moment. Are you shooting people? Are you stealing things? When you go into dialogue, do you insult them or do you try to be nice? I want the game to recognize those choices and react to them. Similarly, the third thing I'd look for is that the story is reacting to my character selection to a small extent. I don't want the story to be too dependent on things you chose when you had no idea what was going on, but also to the actions you have in the game. Now, those are kind of tied together. If you decide to get a bunch of thief skills, you're probably going to steal stuff, and then there's going to be reflection. But I find it hard to believe that somebody would pick those skills and then go, I had no idea people would be mad that I'm stealing their stuff. So you have to take a little responsibility, even at the beginning of the game, to go, if I take that skill to shoot people or to steal their stuff or to say rude things to them, I'm going to handle the consequences for that. The fourth thing about it concerns story still, which is I want it to be nonlinear. I would prefer if I could do things in the order I want to do them. I want to go where I want to go, do what I want to do, and the game should react to that. It's why I say in a lot of my interviews, I prefer a player-driven story, not a story-driven game. A story-driven game is some narrative designer decided this is how the story's going to unfold and you will play this way. I don't like that. I like player-driven story, where there's a lot of story elements out there ready to be activated and the player comes along and activates the ones based on their actions. And then the fifth thing, the last thing I'll talk about story, is I want it to have multiple endings. If I can do things in different orders and the game is reacting to me based on what I'm doing, I totally expect that there should be different endings. And sometimes I'm talking dramatically different endings, like a good ending, a bad ending, a sad ending, a happy ending, an ending with all my companions, and what happened to them. Those are what I'm talking about when I'm talking about different endings. I don't mean it's dramatically different, like in this one you saved the town, and this one the world blew up. I don't need that dramatic of a difference, but I do want multiple endings that reflect what you did. That kind of gets me into gating, but I'm not just talking about story gating. I'm also talking about area gating, character advancement gating. I want that based on character choices, not designer choices. And let me give you some examples of what I mean by that. Let's say you have a dungeon and you don't necessarily want the players going in there right away. I'm fine if it's like you need a key to get into the dungeon, or you need a passphrase to get into the dungeon. I'm even fine if it turns out that the character that has the key or the passphrase doesn't even spawn in until later in the game, or is in some hard to find place, so that you're kind of making it so I don't want the character to go in, the player character to go in there until a higher level. What I don't like is if the the door is hard coded, like you cannot enter here until Act 3. And I played games recently that I like, that I step onto a continuation of the map, and it says, nope, you can't go here yet because of your level or because of the story act. And that's another thing. Like if I went up to a door and it said you have to be at least 10th level to open this door, I'd be like, that is the designer like slapping me in the face directly. I'd rather have it be something embedded in the game itself, a key, a passphrase, an item, something. Similarly, now that's something, how to gate story or area. But character advancement I feel the same way about. I prefer that perks that have prerequisites on a skill being a certain level or you buying a previous perk. I'm less a fan of perks that are just level gated. Like you are not allowed to get this perk until you're level 10. Now, if you want to do that, you can always say you can't pick perks on this tier until you've picked at least 3 other perks. And since you know you get a perk every other level, no one's going to be doing that until they've gained 6 levels. That's fine. But I don't like just having it say skill level, you have to be level 10 to pick this perk. Again, it's the designer imposing on the player rather than the player's choices imposing on the player. It sounds really narrow, this definition, but one is the player seeing choices they make which will open up options versus the designer just going, you can't do that till level 10. So I see that. Then the final thing I want to talk about is the world itself. I want the world to be big enough to support exploration and all this player choice I've mentioned. And lots of adventures that aren't the main story. I like it when the world's big enough that you can have lots of side quests. And maybe you can't do all of them. Maybe some of them are gated by the choices you made. Or maybe some of them react. They're available, but they react to the choices you made. You kind of can't do that in a really small, narrow world. So I want a big world for the player to run around in. Now, I said I wasn't going to talk about the order. That's basically my checklist, by the way. That's a checklist. If you have all those, you're an RPG. As you start to remove some, you're less and less of an RPG, to me. Notice the order I went in. I went systems, story, setting. That is exactly the opposite of how I tell you to make your game. When you're designing a game, I tell you to go setting, story, system. The reason I went this way is this is often how games present themselves. The player is usually thrust into character creation and needs to know what these systems are. It's what's thrown at them first. Then they start playing and they quickly learn, if not from a cinematic before or after they made their character, as soon as they get into the game, what kind of story they're going to be thrust into. Are you the chosen one? Are you some amnesiac trying to find out who he is? Are you trying to find this magic special item? And then as you play, the setting unfolds. And even though you had a rough idea of what it might be, this is a fantasy world, you start to learn, oh, this is a fantasy world where all the dwarves disappeared, or this is a fantasy world that's having an industrial revolution. You walk through what that means. You may have heard it, you may have seen it on the back of the box, but you learn what that is as you're playing. So it's an interesting thing that it didn't even occur to me that the order I tell designers to make a game in is often the opposite order in which it unfolds to the player. Now, many people disagree on what's an RPG and what isn't an RPG. Some of it comes down to how many things on my checklist they require. Some require all of them. If you're missing one, you are no longer an RPG. Some just require some of them, but they're hard choices. Those choices are, those features are demanded. Like, I don't require all of these, but you have to have like 1, 2, and 5. And if you don't have that, you're not an RPG. And then there are other people like me who go, well, the more of these you have, the more RPG-like you are. And the less of these you have, the less RPG you are. And people sometimes weight them differently too. Like, you're more of an RPG if my choices matter. You're slightly less of an RPG if I can't make my character at the beginning. So they weight them differently. And then, of course, some people have things that aren't even on my list. And they're like, nope, you have to have this or you're not an RPG. Or here's some additional things that I look for in my RPGs. And those are fine. Like I said, I view the space of RPGs as a continuum. You can call them hard RPGs, soft RPGs, hardcore versus, casual, whatever you want to call them. Some people even say once you don't have enough of these, this becomes an adventure game or a shooter with RPG elements and the elements off the checklist that it does have. The only thing I would say is don't get too hung up on this. Like all things that are a continuum, the dividing line, which you think is hard coded and set in stone, isn't as hard coded as you thought. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, I'm going to link the video below where I tell my little D&D koan about day and night. And that should tell you why I feel making a hard line in the sand about this is an RPG and this isn't is doomed to fail. So if you're trying to do that, you're not going to be successful. But that checklist I just said is my list of what I think makes an RPG. The more of them you have, the more I'll call you an RPG. The less of them, the less of an RPG you have, until finally you're not an RPG anymore. And that's my thoughts on what is an RPG.